Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Optimizing IT Procurement, the Success in Centralization. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. As you can see there, my name is Liam Sabans. I am the client success team lead at TecEx. I manage one of the key client success teams in the business, and we have clients across all three regions, being LATAM, EMEA, and APAC regions. I've worked with hundreds of different reseller clients across both the US and the EU over the past few years. And I've effectively worked with several different types of reseller teams within those clients, those teams being examples such as the sales team, procurement teams, and logistics teams. Cool. So I'm going to be covering the following topics.
Thanks to Liam for introducing the concept for us today. My name is Anthony Rousseau. I am the current head of sales of the technology procurement division at TecEx. I formerly ran what we call the commercial transaction division at TecEx, largely dealing with foreign currency and local invoicing, which falls outside of the ambit of today's discussion in the main. Briefly, what I'll be covering, first of all, is the type of transactions that we see here at TecEx on a daily basis, and how centralized procurement is placed to solve the problems associated with those transactions. Secondly, we'll be talking about some deal winning, specifically in relation to the types of objections you're likely to get from your end users when posing a centralized procurement model. The third is a real world problem that we faced here at TecEx and the real world solution that we implemented to solve it. And then lastly, next steps.
Cool. So kicking everything off, as I mentioned, we're just going to define this concept of procurement in the concept, or rather within the IT hardware value chain. So here at TecEx and in the tech world generally, we see this typical value chain when it comes to hardware sales transactions, where it begins with the OEM or original equipment manufacturer that sells its hardware products to the distributor. The distributor then on-sells those products to a reseller, in many cases a value-added reseller that will add some type of value-added benefit to the software or value-added solution to the software. That's typically by way of some manner of configuration. There may be an assembling of a hardware solution, such as a server rack with accessories, or it could be something as simple as a piece of hardware being loaded with bespoke software. Once those value-added solutions have effectively been applied to the hardware by the reseller would then typically sell the hardware onto the end user. Now, there are various iterations of this. It's not usually as simple as has been explained here. You can, in some cases, see an OEM selling directly to a reseller, or you may, for example, see a distributor selling directly to an end user in certain cases. So it is a little bit of a spider web in practice, but typically we see the value chain flowing like this and the hardware going down from 1 to 4. So to define the problem statement, as I mentioned, this is something that we see at TecEx every day. And effectively what happens is an end customer will approach a reseller. In our example, we're just going to focus on the US. So in this case, we have a US end customer approaching a US reseller with a hardware request. But that hardware needs to be delivered to the end customer's subsidiary office or entity in the foreign destination in question, in this example in India. So typically, when we are approached by a reseller that perhaps doesn't have a lot of international shipping experience, or perhaps doesn't have a lot of knowledge on third-party IOR services, that type of reseller would typically advise its customer that it can't get the hardware from the USA into the foreign destination, in our case in India, and that the customer should accordingly try to procure that hardware locally within that destination country, as I mentioned in our case in India. So in order to do this, the end customer is effectively going to need to go through a few processes one of which is deploying one of its internal procurement resources or employees to source and effectively acquire that hardware from a local OEM or distributor in India that can supply the goods to the end customer's subsidiary or entity in India. So in doing this, the local OEM or distributor is effectively going to need to be onboarded by the end customer's Indian office or entity. And in doing that, they're going to need to follow any given amount of onboarding processes. You would, in the majority of cases, require a finance onboarding, perhaps a legal onboarding where the legal teams chats about the contractual terms that they're going to have, all obviously from an Indian perspective. And the eventual implication of that is that a sale is going to be made in India once all those onboarding processes have been completed, with the hardware being delivered by the OEM or the distributor as is. So the hardware is obviously going to be stock standard by virtue of the fact that the reseller is not going to have any access to the hardware. No value added services or benefits are going to be applied to that hardware. The end customer in India is going to receive the hardware as is. So obviously by the time the hardware is eventually delivered to the end customer's Indian subsidiary or office, a number of weeks have typically gone by following all of the onboarding processes and then that local purchase process going forward, with the eventual implication that the reseller gets cut out of that deal completely. So yeah, what we're effectively speaking about here is the concept of centralized procurement. The reseller effectively gets cut out of the deal entirely, given that they have effectively referred their customer to an OEM or distributor based in India. And this whole concept that we have now defined here, or problem statement that we have defined, is what we refer to here at TecEx as local or in-country procurement. So just breaking the definition down into more simple components, we have the US reseller advising its customer that it cannot supply its own hardware to the foreign destination in question. The hardware therefore gets procured locally or in country, as we said, directly from the OEM or distributor in India, with the eventual implication that the US reseller loses out on that deal. The reseller does not make a sale at all. So moving on to this concept of central procurement, here at TecEx, we obviously view this concept of central procurement or following a central procurement methodology as a solution to this local procurement or in-country procurement problem that we face when the end customer approaches the reseller with these requirements. So in our example here, you can see the reseller effectively can follow its standard process in the USA, where it advises the US end customer to effectively follow the strategy, given the fact that it does have third-party IOR capabilities or a partnership with a third-party IOR provider that can get the gear into country for them. So in this example, we have the US reseller being based in San Francisco. That US reseller purchases the primary server products from a distributor based in New Jersey, USA. It also then purchases certain accessory products or maybe other hardware items, whatever those may be, from a different distributor based in Phoenix, Arizona, again, within the USA, and then contracts with each of those US distributors to send the respective hardware products to the reseller's warehouse in San Francisco, where its engineers can then get their hands on the hardware and configure the hardware as per the reseller's specifications that it has marketed to its end customer. So that reseller, being a value-added reseller, as I mentioned, is then going to perform those value-added services to those products in San Francisco, after which it's going to sell the hardware to the end customer's US entity, in this example, in Texas. So This is what we're talking about when we refer to the centralized procurement strategy or methodology. And this is effectively what we here at TecEx like to advise our reseller clients on, or even our end user clients when they are purchasing from a reseller. So in defining the central procurement strategy, as you can see, all of the sales occur centrally within the USA, all with local purchase orders being cut. And I know Anthony is going to touch on that in his section of the presentation to follow. But effectively, what's happening here is both distributors and the end customer are cutting local purchase orders, and the reseller is cutting a US invoice in USD denominated currency. So effectively, the transactions are all happening within the USA. The reseller ends up with an assembled hardware product that's configured as per its specifications in San Francisco, and it is then put in a position where it gets to sell that hardware effectively across the globe. So just flowing from that into the benefits that we see with the centralized procurement model or strategy to be followed by the reseller in conjunction with its end user or end customer. I think the important thing to note in this regard is the fact that the benefits of this model get passed on from the US reseller to the US end customer when using this method. So first benefits, obviously, that it's cheaper in that it allows for increased purchasing power and benefits of scale. So what we mean by that is that the reseller can rely on its existing relationships that it has with the two distributors in our example, or its US distributors. Often the reseller will have certain exclusivity arrangements, perhaps with those distributors. There'll be certain volume commitments that it may have, and it can then effectively rely on the bulk discounts that would be offered to the distributor, given the fact that the reseller does business with those distributors on a day-to-day basis. And that cost saving is then obviously passed on from the reseller to the end customer when the reseller sells to the end customer, given that it is enjoying those cost saving benefits. So yeah, moving on to the next benefits, there's obviously decreased lead times, given the fact that the end customer does not have to follow those onboarding processes in India. No resources are wasted in effectively trying to onboard the relevant OEM or distributor, finding those OEMs or distributors if the reseller doesn't refer the end customer to them. So that's effectively the part where you see the major decrease in lead times. The end customer doesn't have to worry about any of those in-country onboardings. There's a standard purchasing process. So as I mentioned, there's one purchase order that gets cut by the US end customer, with the invoice being issued by the US reseller. That reseller and end customer get to deal with the contacts that they always deal with in the US, and there's no foreign contacts that need to be consulted with effectively. There is less risk in that there are no cross-border transactions or forex implications, given that all of the sales take place in the USA. As I've said, all USD denominated transactions in the US. And then the final benefit obviously being the fact that the reseller is provided with a global reach where it can tell its end customer that it is able to deliver those hardware products across the globe. So overall, we are of the view that a DDP solution that can be provided by a third-party IOR partner effectively advocates for the centralized procurement methodology. As I mentioned, we like to advise our reseller clients to follow this type of a methodology, keep things contractual between the US reseller and the US customer. So my conclusion to the first half of this presentation is effectively that all of our reseller clients should be advising their end customers to follow the centralized procurement strategy.
Great, thanks for that, Liam. I think just before we go into a little bit more depth, it's important for us to really acknowledge and talk a little about the type of transactions that we see here at TecEx on a daily basis. There are sort of three largely simplified groups. The first one is what we would call a local sale, or an absolute local sale, or a local sale with local deployment. This is your stock standard, US reseller transaction where both the sold from party as well as the sold to party are located within the United States, as well as the ship from address and the delivery address being located within the US. In this type of transaction, there really is no international complexity, and really the need to partner with us is less apparent. The second type of transaction, which is the first iteration of international complexity, is what we'll call a local sale with international deployment requirements. So as you can see in the purchase order here, the sold from party is still the value-added reseller located in the United States. However, the bill to party, as well as the bill to party being located within the United States. However, important to note, the ship to address in this case is a data center located internationally, in this case in Mumbai, India. Now, this is the first iteration where we see the benefits of centralized procurement coming in that your end user, despite requiring an international deployment, is still able to source from its trusted reseller within the US. The third type of transaction, bit of a problem child, is what we'll call the international transaction or international sale with international deployment. In this case, you can see that the sold from party is again located in the United States. However, in this case, the buying party is located in a foreign country, in this case, India. Again, there's an international deployment in that the goods need to be deployed to a data center in India. Now, whilst the scope of this transaction is a little bit out of the scope of today's webinar, there's an important point to make on the next slide. The question is for you as a value-added reseller located in the US. Which of these transactions can be executed on using a centralized procurement model? And that is a trick question because the answer is all of them. A centralized procurement model can be scaled, adjusted, and implemented in a way that allows you as a value-added reseller to deal on any deal globally, regardless of transaction requirements. So now that we know that every deal is on the table, the question is, how do we win them? Now, in our experience at TecEx, we've come across plenty end users that have an abundance of complaints and concerns regarding the centralized procurement model. The first is the general complexity associated with the international movement of goods, be that the customs clearance process, international freight, risk of loss in international shipping, final mile delivery, and the such like. Secondly is the perceived unexpected increase in lead times due to international movement of goods, as well as customs clearance, which our clients tend to believe is unpredictable. The third is compliance complexity. As you're likely aware, these networking type products have different compliance requirements in different jurisdictions. And of course, your end user is rightly asking questions that the goods are going to be delivered in a compliant manner. The third is the legal audit and financial risk associated with being the importer of goods, specifically networking gear, into foreign countries. Fourth is the perceived inability to accurately project cost international legs or international deployments, mostly because of the unpredictability associated with customs clearance, final mile delivery costs, and associated. And then finally, the end user's belief that they will need to internally project manage this entire process, dedicate internal resources, their procurement team or their logistics team to project manage this process, despite the fact that they might not have the expertise to do so. So we saw these problems play out in a real world example that we were faced with at TecEx quite recently. We were approached by a reseller client looking to get their gear from the US. We were approached by a reseller who had an end user client who was looking to get gear sourced from the US to a single end user in China, India, Brazil, and Mexico. Our reseller client was struggling to pitch on the deal and was concerned that they were only going to win the US local leg of the transaction. The concerns were the following. The end user was convinced that it was going to be unable to accurately predict the costs associated with the international legs of the transaction if it was to be that our reseller would be winning the international legs. In this case, there was an additional complexity in that the end user was leveraging a financing party who required upfront and accurate quoting to be provided in advance of deployments, and there was really no wiggle room for unforeseen costs. The next was the lead time complexity that the end user perceived was unavoidable in international deployments. More specifically, our end user was convinced that customs clearance issues specifically in China and in India would derail the project critical timelines. Again, the presence of a financing party in this case complicated things further because the financing was only open for a specific period of time, which made the timing of delivery even more project critical. And then largely was the legal complexity in neither the financing party, our reseller client, nor the end user were in a position, both legally or physically, to act as the importer of record into each of these destinations. So our end user was essentially in a position where they had decided they were going to procure locally in China, India, Mexico, and Brazil, and only source from its trusted value-added reseller for the US leg of the transaction. However, this in itself had its own issues. Firstly, as Liam has mentioned, the distributors in each country were not able to match the prices that the value-added reseller client located in the US was able to commit to based on bulk discounting power. The second was large quality assurance concerns, given that there was a very specific project requirement that all of the servers in this case were configured with the same software, had the same accessories, and there was really a concern that the end user would not be able to source all the required accessories, nor install the necessary software in each destination country. And then largely and quite specifically to this transaction, there was a non-negotiable requirement from the financing party that ownership of the goods had to remain within the US. So, what then? Our reseller client came to us posing the problem that they were about to lose out on a potential game-changing deal and they were only going to win the local leg. However, partnering with us as TecEx, as their third-party IOR and customs compliance specialists, we immediately got to work with structuring a transaction, scaling a centralized procurement model that allowed them to deliver on each leg of the transaction. How do we do this? We provide accurate and upfront project costings, inclusive of duties and taxes into each destination country. Secondly, because the goods were being procured centrally by our value-added reseller, the end user's concerns as to varying configurations, difficulties with getting software installed, all of those concerns were met in that their trusted value-added reseller was doing all of the procurement of the constituent parts of the hardware on their behalf, installing the software on their behalf, bespoke solution assembled within the US, deployed internationally, delivered according to project spec. Third, we were able to accurately predict lead times, ensuring that those lead times were built into the financing arrangement with the financing party, making sure that we were able to deliver without any issues of financing invalidity or lapsing. And then lastly, TecEx was perfectly placed as a expert third-party importer of record in each destination country, leveraging our international footprint to protect the end user from the audit, financial, and compliance risks associated with being the listed importer into destination countries. So now that we've seen that centralized procurement is by far the best solution for your end user, and obviously for yourself as a US-based reseller, the question is where to from here? First of all, it's very important that you realize that TecEx is your free resources when targeting these international deals. Using TecEx, no deal is off the table. We are your free resource, be it in getting on calls with your end users, passing on information, whatever the case may be. We are in the process. We win when you win. and we really want to deliver on your end goals with your end users. Lastly, just before we move to the Q&A, please do reach out to us, either Liam or myself. Our email addresses are on screen. We'll be happy to field your questions directly, alternatively point you to the right place in the business, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Awesome, thanks, Ant. That's great. Yeah, we're going to move on to our live Q&A session. It seems that we have received quite a few questions, so we're just going to have to deal with them between the two of us. First one is, can I procure centrally in the US? I can procure centrally in the US, but why can't the local office just handle the import? So, okay, so I mean, the answer to that's probably multifaceted. I think firstly, there is the constraint that the local office does not necessarily have importer of record capabilities. So by virtue of the fact that you have a local office in a foreign destination, that entity is not necessarily set up as an importing entity that can clear customs. So I think that's the first important point. And then I think, Ant, do you have any
I think that is sort of the primary, and then I think there's a very important secondary, is that even if, for example, your local office was set up, legally in a way that would allow it to import, there's of course, it may be that it wants to import low-grade gear or gear for purposes of unselling. When we're talking specifically about importing high-grade dual-use networking gear, it's very likely that you do not want to take the risks associated with being the declared importer of record of networking gear, specifically dual-use networking gear, in multiple countries across the world. There are obviously audit concerns, legal concerns, and financial concerns resulting from those audits. So using a third-party IOR provider, it shields you from any of those negative connotations associated with being the importer.
100%. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for that.
I'll start with the next one. We've got, why is central procurement less risky than centralized buying? Centralized procurement and centralized buying can be seen very much in the same sense. Assuming we say, I think the question may be posed slightly differently, is why is centralized procurement less risky than local buying in country? And the question is quite simply answered in that local buying requires you to build multitude of relationships outside of your trusted relationships with your preferred VAR. Your preferred VAR obviously has its trusted relationships with its distributors in the US. You cannot ensure quality. You cannot ensure bespoke configurations, accurate installation of software. So the real issue is that the risk is that you're not going to be delivering on project specs as accurately as you would be had you gone with a centralized procurement model.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think an important qualifier there is the fact that conceptually, when you need to ask yourself, where is central? When you use the word central, what are you looking at? When you're using the words local or in country, what are you referring to? So I think, yeah, and you addressed that nicely. These are kind of our internal concepts that we have here at TecEx. So the word central can be used quite broadly, but in our context here, we're just giving it a specific definition. Yeah, so I think we can move on to the next one then. Can central procurement decrease my lead time? So I think that was something that I touched on with the benefits of central procurement. The lead time decrease that you're going to experience is obviously due to the fact that the end customer isn't going to be going through this whole sourcing and procurement process in country, in the foreign destination. Yeah. I think that's the one element. And then the second element is that the reseller typically already has those contractual relationships with the relevant OEMs and distributors that it may be purchasing from in the US. So there's no onboarding from a foreign destination perspective, and then there's typically no onboarding from a US internal perspective as well.
The only add-on is that with lead times, what's often forgot about is the actual pre-deployment procurement. So the actual procurement by the value-added reseller. We've seen in our experience that be it the UK, the US, or sort of like the global north largely has the shortest lead times when it comes to sourcing the constituent parts that goes into the type of networking gear that we ship. So whilst it may seem simpler and quicker to buy directly in country, what you'll actually find is that usually your distributor or OEM that you're going to is going to have to specifically order the gear, and their lead times are likely to be much longer than it would be had it been an OEM in the States.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a great one we've got here. You've been using us in the US, as you've been using the US as a home location in the examples, I assume, of the value-added reseller. Do you offer centralized procurement in Canada? Yes. So first of all, just quickly, centralized procurement is sort of a concept. We are able to enable centralized procurement from any location. So in this case, if you are a value-added reseller located in Canada and you have international deployments or international projects that you're deal winning on, yes, we can enable that process. If you're based in Canada, we can act as your third-party IOR partner for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think further to that, we do have a lot of value-added reseller clients in Canada, in the UK, and in the EU as well. We also have a lot of clients based in APAC who are also resellers. I think the majority of them haven't been able to join this webinar, so we've kind of just focused on the US for now. But yeah, we do definitely offer the centralized procurement strategy or methodology that we would advise to a Canadian client, just as we would a US client. I think then we have the last question by the looks of things that's come up here. And the question is, can't my carrier or freight forwarder just do this for me? So that is a question that we receive at least every week, if not every day. So your carrier or freight forwarder do have general clearance capabilities. So if you were, for example, shipping a watch or maybe a textile, maybe, clothing, for example, your freight forwarder may have the capabilities to clear something of a more general nature like that. But what we do find here at TecEx is that because the hardware, the tech hardware that we're shipping is dual use, the majority of destinations that we ship to consider the hardware to be regulated or restricted or controlled. That's the terminology that they usually use. But the overarching concept with that is that the dual use goods are typically restricted, and there are very high compliance requirements going into the majority of destinations. And TecEx has specific capabilities, or another third-party IOR provider will have specific capabilities to clear those dual-use goods. We do have many cases where clients ship without us and ship with a carrier or freight forwarder, and the cargo usually ends up getting stuck in customs. In those cases, you can still contact us and we can usually still deal with it as a stuck shipment. So we can take over. But yeah, typically we don't see the carriers or freight forwarders having the necessary capabilities to clear this type of hardware.
Yeah, just a brief answer to that, Liam. I think what's important to notice, important to note from TecEx is that we have a background team that's constantly monitoring the requirements to clear networking gear in all of these different locations. Those requirements are constantly changing. It's sort of a moving target, but we have dedicated resources that's sort of been preactive in making sure that we're always ready to move your gear. We're in advance of time applying for the necessary licenses, ensuring that we're meeting the changing compliance framework, so that when you're ready to ship, we're ready to ship, and there are no delays.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a good additional point there. We do see regulation changes happening in the various foreign destinations quite often. India is actually a good example, with new compliance requirements coming in on the 1st of January 2024. That's been a big focus for us and a lot of our reseller clients going, in the past few weeks. So we are currently trying to prepare for the new regulations in India as one example of the 200 destinations where we are monitoring the compliance requirements on a daily basis. And yeah, I think that's it. That's all for the Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone for attending our event. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the recording with everyone, and yeah, let's start the video on our social media, so much up for that. But thank you all for attending. It's been a pleasure hosting you. Thank you very, very much. Cheers.